Margaret Elwood sat by the narrow window of her shared nursing home room, her silver-streaked hair tied in a loose bun, hands folded gently over her lap. Outside, the wind bent the tall trees into reluctant dancers, their branches rattling against the glass like a soft knock from nature. She had been living at Rosefield Nursing Home for just under 2 months, placed there by her only daughter, Vanessa, under the guise of recovery from hip surgery, but the recovery had long since passed. What lingered now was a thick fog of loneliness and quiet rejection. The room she shared with an elderly woman named Dora was painted in a dull beige, as uninspiring as the meals served daily at 4 p.m. The scent of antiseptic always lingered, as did the faint smell of old paperbacks and mothballs. Despite its attempt to present itself as a place of care, the home felt more like a waiting room for those whose lives had been quietly filed away. Margaret tried not to dwell on that. She had once been a woman of stature, piano teacher whose students spoke her name with admiration and warmth. Her hands, once so nimble and expressive, now struggled to grasp a teacup without trembling. Vanessa had visited only twice since Margaret had been admitted. The first visit was warm, full of hugs, and feigned reassurance that this was only temporary, that once her house had been reorganized, Margaret would be back. The second visit had been far less enthusiastic, rushed, her daughter glued to her phone while Margaret tried to update her on her health. Vanessa had smiled that familiar, patronizing smile and told her she looked stable, before checking the time and muttering something about a board meeting. Margaret was starting to understand. Temporary was a lie. This place was where she had been sent to be forgotten. The staff was not unkind, but they were overworked and distant. Margaret had befriended a few residents: Dora, her witty roommate, Harold, a retired postman with a knack for telling war stories, and Elise, a former librarian who never stopped quoting poetry. They formed a kind of quiet alliance, a band of ones someone's trying not to fade too quickly. The home's routine was strict and dull, like a metronome marking time in a song no one danced to. Breakfast at 7, therapy at 10, lunch at noon, games at 2, dinner at 4, lights out at 8. Days bled into each other like watercolor left in the rain. One rainy afternoon, Margaret wheeled herself out of her room to sit by the hallway bookshelf, pretending to browse for something she hadn't already read twice. She heard voices coming from the administrator's office, one of them unmistakably her daughter's. Curious, and perhaps needing to hear something hopeful, she crept closer. The door was ajar just enough. She heard the administrator's voice. First, she's doing better, I'd say, adjusting nicely. Vanessa replied, her voice too sharp to be comforting. Good. I honestly can't keep running around checking in on her. I have enough on my plate with work and the boys. She's becoming a burden. A burden. The word sliced through Margaret like a blade. She recoiled instinctively and wheeled herself back down the hallway, the sound of the chair's rubber wheels masking her quick retreat. Her chest tightened, and her throat burned with the tears she refused to let fall. That single word echoed through her, louder than the rain tapping against the windows. Back in her room, she sat still, hands clenched around the fabric of her nightgown. Berta, was that what she had become? The woman who had raised Vanessa, alone after her husband passed, the woman who gave up concerts and recitals to make sure her daughter had everything she needed, was now a burden. Her eyes scanned the modest room, and for the first time, it didn't feel merely dull, it felt like exile. Dora, who had just returned from a visit with her granddaughter, noticed the change in Margaret's demeanor. You okay? She asked, gently, settling into her recliner. Margaret nodded but said nothing. She didn't trust her voice not to crack. That night, as the other residents drifted off to sleep, Margaret stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her past and her present. She thought of her music, the recitals, the students whose lives she had shaped, the laughter in her old house, the smell of warm cinnamon bread in the kitchen, the echo of piano notes in the living room. She thought of Vanessa as a child, dancing around the living room, giggling at her mother's melodies. When had all of that turned into burden? It wasn't the word itself that hurt most, it was the realization that her daughter no longer saw her as someone valuable. She had become an obligation, an item on a checklist. The indignity of it gnawed at her, fueled by the sterile silence of the home. Margaret was not weak. Her body may have faltered, but her mind was still sharp, her spirit quietly fierce. That night, Something inside her shifted. She would not spend her remaining years as someone else's inconvenience. The next day, Margaret joined the residence for breakfast, her face calm but her mind racing. As Harold complained about the mushy eggs and Elise read from a worn copy of Tennyson, Margaret quietly watched the staff, listened to the administrator barking orders, and observed the fraying edges of a facility that once pretended to offer care. The paint was peeling near the fire exits. The garden outside was overgrown. The piano in the activity room hadn't been tuned in years. She began to notice more with each passing day. The food was often undercooked. The nurse's station was understocked, staff rotated too frequently, and no one ever seemed to smile from the heart. It was a business, and like many such places, it was likely poorly managed but profitable. She kept her observations in a small notebook she hid beneath her mattress, documenting everything from the number of residents to the types of staff uniforms. It was almost obsessive, but it gave her purpose. For the first time since her surgery, she wasn't just surviving, she was planning. 2 weeks later, Margaret received a letter. It was from her bank, a reminder about a trust account her late husband had set up years ago. Long before Vanessa was even a teenager, she had forgotten all about it. The amount inside wasn't enormous, but it was substantial, more than enough to buy a comfortable home or something more strategic. She clutched the letter in her hand, eyes fixed out the window as a gust of wind sent the branches thrashing once again. Maybe she couldn't go back to who she was, but she could still decide who she would become next. Margaret didn't speak of her plan to anyone, not even Dora. She remained the quiet, observant woman the staff had grown used to, but inside, she was rebuilding the scaffolding of her dignity. Every moment spent in that facility became fuel for a slow-burning fire inside her, a fire she intended to unleash not in anger, but in transformation. She would not die here. She would rise, and perhaps, if fate allowed, she would do so in a way that no one, not even Vanessa, would ever forget. In that first chapter of this quiet rebellion, Margaret Elwood began to reclaim the one thing the world had tried to take from her sense of worth. Her journey was only beginning, and the music that had faded in her life was about to return in a crescendo that would shake the very walls of the place that dared to call her a burden. Margaret Elwood woke up earlier than usual, the light of dawn barely seeping through the window blinds of room 207. She stared at the pale ceiling above, her thoughts already miles away from the confines of the nursing home. The word burden still clung to her like a second skin, but where once it had felt heavy and shameful, it now ignited something within her, an ember of quiet determination that refused to die out. The notebook beneath her mattress had started filling up with observations and questions. She didn't know exactly what she was planning, but she knew it would not end with her fading into the fabric of that beige room. She went through her morning routine with care. Though it was physically demanding, she made the effort to comb her hair, press her wrinkled slacks, and even dab on a hint of lipstick from the bottom of her purse. Every action, no matter how small, was an act of resistance, a declaration that she was still herself. Margaret Elwood, the woman who used to run a private piano studio and chaired charity events, had not disappeared. She had merely been placed on pause. In the cafeteria, she greeted Dora with a soft smile. Dora's response was quick and warm. "You look like you've got secrets, Maggie." Margaret chuckled. "Maybe I do." After breakfast, the residents were herded into the recreation hall for what was mockingly called free time. Today's activity was crossword puzzles. A young, distracted activities assistant named Cassie passed out the sheets and crayons. Margaret took one politely but set it aside. Her eyes drifted to the far corner of the room where an upright piano sat, dusty and untouched, its bench worn and cracked. That piano had been her companion since she arrived. Each evening, she would sit and let her fingers dance over the keys, if only to remind herself that she was still alive inside. While others focused on their puzzles, Margaret wheeled herself slowly to the piano. She lifted the heavy wooden lid and placed her fingers on the keys. They were colder than usual. She played the opening bars of a Chopin nocturne, her fingers trembling but still capable. Within moments, the room began to hush, conversations paused, and even the staff looked up. Margaret was not just playing notes, she was telling a story of grief, of grace, and of rising despite being discarded. As she finished, a small ripple of applause echoed in the hall. Elise dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. You always make me feel like I'm 20 again, she whispered. But what caught Margaret's attention was the silent arrival of a man in a suit standing by the hallway door. Tall, broad-shouldered, and slightly balding, he looked out of place among the pastel walls and aged faces. He waited patiently, hands folded, until the music ended. Then he clapped slowly and walked forward. Miss Elwood, he asked. She blinked in confusion. Yes, I'm Gregory Marston. I was your student, over 30 years ago. My mother told me you were here. Margaret's eyes widened. She studied his face and slowly, recognition began to bloom. Gregory, little Greg from the Tuesday class. He laughed, clearly touched that she remembered. Not so little anymore, I'm afraid. They shared a brief, emotional embrace. Margaret introduced him to Dora and Elise. Then they moved into the garden courtyard to catch up. The sun had begun its slow climb, casting dappled shadows across the overgrown hedges. Gregory looked uncomfortable as he took in the state of the grounds, the rusted swing, the broken benches, the neglected flower beds. This place, he began, hesitating. Is it as bad as it looks? Margaret smiled faintly. Worse, but it's not the place itself, Greg. It's what it represents. For some, it's the end. For me, it's a waiting room I never asked to sit in. He frowned deeply. And Vanessa, she's the one who brought you here. Yes. Told me it would be temporary. That she'd fix up my house and then bring me home. But I overheard her last week. Margaret paused, her voice tightening. She called me a burden. Gregory winced. I'm so sorry, Miss Elwood. That's not what you deserve. You gave me everything. Your time, your patience, your belief, when I had none in myself. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. That means more than you know. They sat in silence for a while before Gregory pulled out a business card and handed it to her. I work in real estate development now. I specialize in undervalued properties, and I know a mismanaged operation when I see one. If this place ever gives you trouble or if you ever want out, you call me. I'll help you. Margaret tucked the card into her sweater. Thank you, Greg. Truly. That evening, after dinner, she sat in her room long after Dora had fallen asleep. She studied the card, turning it over between her fingers. The idea that had been growing inside her like a slow, stubborn seed suddenly began to take root. Maybe she didn't just want to leave the home. Maybe she wanted to own it. She had no illusions. Buying a nursing home was not a small feat. It required capital, legal assistance, paperwork, and strategy. But if there was one thing Margaret had, it was the ability to plan. Her years teaching music had trained her in patience, precision, and persistence. The next morning, she called the bank using the old Nokia phone she still kept hidden in her drawer. She confirmed the balance in the trust account her late husband had left. It was more than she expected. A lifetime of modest living and careful saving had created a quiet fortune. Vanessa didn't even know it existed. Over the next week, Margaret wrote to Gregory. They exchanged letters and occasional short calls. He introduced her to a lawyer, Adeline Rourke, who specialized in elder rights and business acquisitions. Adeline, a sharp and dignified woman in her early 70s, was intrigued by Margaret's resolve. You're not the first person to be discarded, Mrs. Elwood, she said in their first conversation, but you may be the first one to take control like this. Together, they began the slow process of inquiry. Gregory helped gather information about the nursing home's ownership. It turned out Rosefield was privately owned by an aging businessman named Jacob Blevins, who lived 2 states away. His health was in decline, and his only son had no interest in continuing the business. Word was that Blevins had been considering selling quietly to avoid panic among the residents and staff. When Adeline confirmed that Blevins might be open to offers, Margaret's vision sharpened. She didn't want to run the home out of revenge, wanted to transform it into a sanctuary, a place where no one would be called a burden, a place where dignity would be served alongside dinner. She resumed her daily observations with renewed purpose. She documented which staff members were kind, which cut corners, and which ones genuinely cared. She made sketches of the floor plan from memory. She even interviewed residents casually, asking what they would improve if they could. Asterisk to everyone around her, Margaret seemed like a sweet old woman with a fondness for music and quiet wisdom. But beneath that soft demeanor was a mind working like a grand composer, layering notes, building themes, preparing for the crescendo. Asterisk, she thought of her husband, Charles, and how he had once called her a general with a lullaby voice. He had believed in her strength, and now, as she watched the sun set through the window, she imagined him smiling at her from the other side. Asterisk, the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but she no longer felt powerless. She was not done. In fact, she was just beginning. Asterisk, and in the soft silence of her room, Margaret Elwood opened her notebook and wrote in bold, confident letters, "I will buy Rosefield." Then she turned the page and began outlining exactly how. Rain pattered gently against the windows of Rosefield as Margaret sat in the small courtyard garden, her notebook perched on her lap. The pages were already filled with tightly scribbled notes, floor plans drawn from memory, staff behavior summaries, menus, and questions she wanted to ask. Each word on the page represented her reclaiming control. Each line, a rebellion against being forgotten. Though the hedges were unkempt and the flowers were wilting from neglect, the air was cool, and the solitude allowed her to think clearly. In her heart, she had already decided that she would buy this place, restore its dignity, and change the narrative society had written for women like her. Asterisk, it was on that quiet morning, as she was underlining a section titled Reputation Risk Management, that Gregory Marsden returned. He had called ahead and arranged the visit through Adeline. Margaret looked up and smiled as he walked through the archway, holding a paper bag of pastries and a folder under his arm. His presence, tall and confident, seemed to bring with it a strange promise, one that whispered of freedom and transformation. Asterisk, I brought croissants, Gregory said with a grin, and something more substantial. Asterisk, she welcomed him warmly and motioned toward the bench beside her. They sat together, unwrapping the pastries first. Once the first bites were enjoyed, Gregory opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Asterisk, I've had Adeline and her assistant run a background check on Rosefield's current ownership, he began. Turns out, it's still under the name of Jacob Levins. He's 79, suffering from early-stage Alzheimer's, and his son, Dylan, has zero interest in eldercare management. Apparently, he's in tech, lives in Seattle. The nursing home has been up for discreet sale for months, but no one wants to touch it because of the cost of renovation and the reputation risk. Asterisk, Margaret tilted her head. What kind of reputation? Asterisk, Gregory hesitated. There have been quiet complaints. Understaffing, medication mismanagement, and one negligence lawsuit from a family 2 years ago, settled out of court. Asterisk, Margaret sighed. I've seen the cracks firsthand. The worst part is the emotional neglect. Asterisk, Gregory nodded. And that's why you can turn this around. You don't just want to flip the place, you want to heal it. That vision changes everything. There's something buyers overlook when they only see margins. But if you're willing to lead, the change can become the story. You're the story. Asterisk, Margaret gave a soft, knowing smile. I've been invisible too long. I think it's time I became visible again. And if it means changing this place, I'm all in. Asterisk, Gregory reached into the folder again and pulled out a second stack. Financing strategies. He had run some estimates. You have enough in your trust to cover the down payment, but to avoid dipping too far into your reserves, I've reached out to a few socially minded investment partners. They're interested in elder care with a purpose. If you pitch it right, an ethical, woman-led transformation of a failing facility, find supporters. I don't want my daughter involved, Margaret said suddenly, her voice steely. Gregory nodded. I understand. Asterisk, I know how it sounds, spiteful, even petty, but this isn't about hurting her. It's about not allowing her to rewrite the rest of my life. Asterisk, you don't owe me an explanation, he said gently. You're not a burden, and you don't have to apologize for reclaiming your power. Asterisk, a long silence settled between them before Margaret asked the question that had been troubling her quietly, and the legal side of things. Asterisk, I spoke to Adeline this morning. She's already drafted a letter of intent. Once signed, it will formally begin the purchase process. We'll keep your name confidential for now. It'll go through a holding trust we've established under a neutral name, Willowlight Holdings. Asterisk, Margaret looked impressed. Sounds like a piano piece. Asterisk, he smiled. That's what I thought too. Asterisk, that afternoon, They reviewed every part of the deal: licenses, liabilities, state requirements, and renovation estimates. Gregory's team would oversee the business side, but the leadership model and ethos would come from Margaret. She would be the soul of the transformation. After their lengthy planning session, Gregory walked her back inside. As they passed the common lounge, they spotted Dora dozing under a crochet blanket, a crossword puzzle slipping from her fingers. Harold sat nearby, listening to old Sinatra on his headphones. A nurse was trying to console a woman who had forgotten where she was. These people need more than medicine, Margaret said softly. They need warmth, they need stories, they need to feel seen. They will, Gregory promised. Back in her room, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, emotionally full but physically tired. Dora opened her eyes and stretched, noticing the look on her friend's face. You've been up to something, Dora said with a yawn. Margaret chuckled. Would you believe me if I said I'm buying this place? Dora's eyes widened. You're serious? I am. Well, damn, Dora whispered with a mischievous grin. If anyone can pull it off, it's you. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, eyes open, watching the moonlight wash across the ceiling. It was the first time in years she felt excited about something, terrified too, but mostly alive. It reminded her of her youth, when she and Charles first bought their little townhouse and built a life from scratch. She remembered the wallpapering disasters, the out-of-tune pianos, and the evenings they spent dreaming with coffee and radio music humming in the background. In the morning, she wrote a letter to Adeline, agreeing to the letter of intent. She dictated it slowly, carefully, then signed it with a steady hand. She then dictated a second letter to be held in reserve, a personal letter to Vanessa. One she might send one day, explaining everything, not out of spite but out of truth. The days that followed were full of silent progress. Gregory and Adeline continued legal work, while Margaret shifted her energy toward building a vision. She consulted quietly with the nicer nurses, asking what they would improve if given the chance. She read reviews online. She listened during family visits. No one suspected her intentions, and she preferred it that way. A week later, she and Gregory met again, this time with Adeline and a former geriatric care manager named Henry, who had agreed to serve as a consultant. Henry had decades of experience and a deep empathy for elderly patients. Here's what we propose, Margaret said during their sit-down, speaking for the first time not just as a resident, but as a future leader. This home will be rebranded under a new name, Linden Haven. It will focus on 3 principles: compassionate care, family integration, and creative enrichment. Adeline nodded approvingly. And your role? I'll be the founding director. Eventually I'll hire a younger administrator, but I want to oversee the first phase personally. Gregory added. We've already begun scouting new kitchen staff, activity planners, and an art therapist. Henry smiled. Then you're not just buying a nursing home, you're building a community. The final document they reviewed was the renovation schedule. The plan was to make improvements in stages to avoid disrupting residents too much. They'd start with the dining hall and gardens, then upgrade the rooms with softer lighting, improved bedding, and better accessibility. Features, I want a piano in every wing, Margaret added. Music shouldn't be a luxury. As they finalized the meeting, Adeline turned to Margaret and said, You're not just changing Rosefield, you're changing the way aging is perceived. That evening, Margaret returned to her piano, her fingers striking the keys with renewed certainty. Other residents gathered once more, instinctively drawn to her playing. Dora leaned in and whispered, That fire in you, it's catching. Margaret smiled. Good. I want them all to feel it. That night, as she slid her notebook back beneath the mattress, she didn't feel like a woman discarded or a shadow of her past. She felt like a conductor standing at the edge of a great symphony, baton raised, ready to summon something beautiful. This time, she wasn't waiting for change, she was composing it. The days at Rosefield began to move differently from Margaret Elwood. The routines remained the same on the surface: breakfast at 7, checkups at 10, lunch before noon, but for Margaret, each hour now held purpose. She was no longer drifting. Every interaction, every hallway conversation, every overheard complaint became a data point. Her mind, sharp as ever, had fully awakened to a new rhythm: observation, Analysis. Preparation. The legal path was underway. Gregory had secured a preliminary agreement from Jacob Blevins, the current owner. Blevins had no emotional attachment to the facility and saw it merely as a line item in his portfolio. The prospect of a silent, swift transition appealed to him, especially since his health was failing and his son had no desire to inherit the business. With Adeline Rourke guiding the paperwork, the terms were being set. Rosefield would soon be under the care of Willowlight Holdings, with Margaret Elwood as its true heartbeat. The final pieces of the puzzle were the logistics. How to gather internal intelligence and prepare for the soft transition without alarming staff or residents. To that end, Margaret initiated what she privately called the listening phase. She spent her afternoons sitting quietly with other residents, inviting conversation. Asking questions masked as casual interest. She spoke with Elise about the library space, which had been shuttered for lack of funds. With a few donations. It could be lovely again, Elise said, touching the frayed edges of her worn paperback. Books give us some place to go when we can't walk far anymore. She nodded in agreement and wrote it down. Revive library. Budget $500. She asked Harold about the food. It's edible, he muttered, but I miss real coffee. Not this powdered sludge. Upgrade coffee machines. Add real beans option. Morale booster. She even made subtle inquiries with the nurse aides. Miriam, a soft-spoken evening nurse who'd worked there for over a decade, revealed the strain they were under. Short staffing is the biggest issue, she said one night while taking Margaret's vitals. They keep hiring agency temps who don't know the residents. No consistency, no heart. Margaret pressed gently. If it were up to you, what would you change? More full-time hires, more training, a focus on the person, not the chart. That line stayed with Margaret. Person, not chart. She passed that phrase to Gregory in their next update call. He loved it. It's your brand already, he said. Margaret, this is more than a rescue, it's a reimagining. Her next move came quietly but deliberately. She requested a private meeting with the current administrator, Mrs. Carla Denning, under the pretense of voicing some general concerns. Carla, a strict woman with cropped gray hair and a tendency to check her smartwatch mid-conversation, agreed with disinterest. They met in the small administrative office at the far end of the building. I'll make this brief. Margaret began, folding her hands on her lap. I've noticed gaps in care. Some of the residents are uncomfortable raising issues, so I thought I'd compile them for you. Carla sighed. We have a feedback form in the front lobby. I know. This is a different kind of list. Carla took the papers. Margaret slid forward 2 typed pages detailing everything from inconsistent medication timing to the lack of cultural programs for residents of different backgrounds. You've been busy, Carla murmured, eyes scanning the pages. I don't want to cause trouble, Margaret said evenly. I just want to help. You're a resident, not staff, Carla snapped, though her tone was clipped more from fear than irritation. It's not your job to monitor operations. No, Margaret replied, but it is my right to speak when things affect my well-being, and that of my friends. Carla hesitated. The old woman in front of her wasn't confrontational, but she was clearly not someone to be brushed aside either. Her spine was straight, her voice controlled, her eyes focused. Carla nodded curtly. We'll look into it. Margaret rose, thanked her, and walked away, another step complete. Behind the scenes, things were moving fast. Adeline had assembled a trusted group of advisors experts in healthcare operations, senior living management, and nonprofit fundraising. They formed a quiet, powerful brain trust around Margaret, offering advice while respecting her as the visionary leader of the change. One of those experts was Percy Roth, a retired healthcare accountant with thick glasses and a fondness for lemon drops. Percy spent 3 days reviewing Rosefield's financial records, which Adeline acquired through Gregory's property team. He visited Margaret on a Wednesday morning, plopped down beside her in the garden, and said, "This place is bleeding money." She raised an eyebrow. Because of the staff. Partially. Mostly mismanagement. They're spending more on temporary staff contracts than it would cost to hire people full-time. They're using outdated suppliers, and they've let insurance liabilities pile up by ignoring code compliance. Margaret remained calm. Can we fix it? He chuckled. With your vision. Yes, but it'll take work. You'll need a new care model, better vendors, and updated policies. But it's doable. Asterisk, he passed her a simple folder marked efficiency plan. She opened it to find a streamlined budget proposal, cost-saving ideas, and a revised staffing structure. Asterisk, I thought I was just buying a building, she murmured. Asterisk, you're buying a future, Percy said. Asterisk, Margaret spent the next week quietly implementing her personal touches under the radar. She used a portion of her own money to buy a new upright piano for the lounge. She had it delivered discreetly as a donation from a friend. When it arrived, there was a buzz among the residents. They gathered as she played again, this time accompanied by Elise reading poetry aloud and Harold humming along. Asterisk, even staff stopped to watch. It was the first time in months that genuine joy rippled through the home. Asterisk, at dinner that night, Margaret was approached by Miriam again. Thank you for the music, she said. You brought life into the air. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. There's more where that came from. Asterisk, that night, she sat in bed and looked around her room. The walls were still beige, the bed still hard, the air still faintly smelled of disinfectant, but something had shifted. Hope had crept into the corners. Even Dora sensed it. Asterisk, you're building something, Dora said from her side of the room. Margaret didn't deny it. I never had children, Dora continued, but if I did, I'd want them to grow up and become someone like you. Margaret turned away to hide her tears. Later that week, Gregory arranged a private meeting with Dylan Blevins, the disinterested heir to the nursing home. They met at a cafe near his office in Seattle, far away from the quiet halls of Rosefield. Gregory presented the proposal clearly and with passion. Dylan, more preoccupied with his smartwatch than the paper in front of him, agreed with a shrug. Asterisk, if the numbers work and the deal's clean, I'm fine stepping back. Asterisk, Gregory pressed. No media attention, no leaks. The transition must be quiet. Asterisk, Dylan nodded. Fine, just make sure my dad gets his payout. Asterisk, with that final conversation, the final legal obstacle was removed. All that remained was the official signing scheduled for 3 weeks out. Asterisk, Margaret was ready. Almost at asterisk, she knew there was one more thing she needed to do before the reveal. Something symbolic. Something that would reclaim not just her dignity, but the very ground it had been stripped from. Asterisk, she contacted Gregory and asked for a favor. Asterisk, can you help me buy back my old house? She asked quietly. Asterisk, he paused. You think Vanessa will sell it? Asterisk, she already did, Margaret replied. 6 months ago. She didn't tell me, but I checked the records. It's owned by a firm now. A shell company. One of your rivals. Asterisk, Gregory whistled. That's cold. Asterisk, I don't want to move back in. I just want to stand in the living room one last time before I close that chapter forever. I'll make it happen, he promised. When Margaret hung up the phone, she sat in silence. Asterisk, the woman who had once been labeled a burden was becoming a businesswoman, a visionary, a leader. Asterisk, and she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Asterisk, the morning of the official document signing arrived with a stillness that hung heavy in the air, as though the very walls of Rosefield understood that a shift was underway. Margaret Elwood rose early, her body aching but her mind sharp. She dressed with care navy blue slacks, a cream blouse, and a shawl her late husband had gifted her on their 30th anniversary. Her hair was combed into a neat twist, and her lipstick applied with the precision of a woman who refused to let time dull her dignity. Asterisk, she sat by the window for a moment, watching the fog lift from the hedgerows. This home, this once forgotten, decaying building was about to change hands. And with that change, Margaret was about to rewrite her narrative. No longer the discarded mother, no longer the patient waiting for the end, no longer someone people looked through or past. She was the future of this place. Asterisk, Gregory Marston arrived just after 9. His usual light-hearted demeanor was replaced by a quiet solemnity. Behind him followed Adeline Rourke, dignified as ever in a tailored grey suit, and Percy Roth, carrying a leather-bound portfolio under one arm. They entered discreetly through the back entrance of the home to avoid drawing attention from the staff or other residents. The meeting was scheduled in the small conference room near the administration wing, one Margaret had never been allowed to enter before. Today, it would become the room where she took back her power. Asterisk, inside, Jacob Blevins sat with his attorney. His face was sunken and pale, but his eyes remained alert, if slightly disinterested. Margaret entered slowly, leaning slightly on her cane. Their eyes met. He gave a small nod of recognition. "You must be the buyer," he said without warmth. Margaret replied. Well, he muttered. "She's all yours." Papers were spread across the table. Adeline went over every section with deliberate care, finalizing the transfer of ownership, outlining the property assets, noting the required disclosures. Margaret initialed, signed, and reviewed page after page with a steady hand. It was as though she had done this before, even though it was all new. But her soul, her inner compass knew what this meant. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a reclamation of identity. When the final signature was placed and the final seal stamped, Gregory looked over at her with a proud smile. "You did it," he said softly. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "No, we did it. All of us." Jacob stood, extended a hand, and Margaret shook it. "Take care of it," he said. "It used to mean something. I intend to make it mean something again." With the documents signed. Adeline handed her a small folder. Inside it was a certificate of ownership and a formal transfer letter. "It's yours now. You can begin the rebranding process whenever you like." That afternoon, the first of many changes quietly took place. Margaret had already selected a trusted core team with Gregory's help: Miriam the nurse, Percy as financial advisor, Henry as the operations consultant, and Elise as the resident engagement coordinator. They formed the soul of what she called the Linden Circle, a leadership collective dedicated to rebuilding Rosefield into Lindenhaven, a name chosen for its symbolism, the linden tree, long associated with healing, love, and community. The first task was to audit everything. Margaret, with the help of Henry and a small internal team, reviewed meal plans, nursing schedules, supplier contracts, and building safety logs. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Many aspects of the home were running on autopilot, surviving more out of habit than intention. Margaret immediately enacted the 3-week care sprint. In 21 days, all departments would begin transformation. The dining hall would receive new appliances and updated menus with real options. The activity room would be painted, lit properly, and re-equipped. The garden would be cleared and planted with flowers chosen by the residents themselves. A small music library would be installed, and Margaret personally oversaw the tuning and repair of every piano in the facility. Word spread slowly but surely among the residents. They noticed how staff smiled more, how new faces, kind, engaged faces were joining the team. They saw paint buckets and flower pots replacing the dull silence of decay. Whispers turned to excitement. For the first time in years, people began planning ahead. "I hear they're bringing back movie night," one resident whispered. "She's adding Tai Chi classes," said another. "They're letting us vote on the next theme for the dining hall." Meanwhile, Vanessa remained unaware. Margaret had kept her at arm's length. There were no calls, no emails, no shared updates. The distance was both painful and necessary. Vanessa had made her decision, and now Margaret had made hers. That changed on the Friday of the second week. When Vanessa unexpectedly showed up at Rosefield, she strode through the front entrance in her sharp heels and oversized designer bag, talking loudly into her phone. Staff looked confused. None had seen her in months. She headed straight to room 207. Margaret looked up from her notebook as her daughter entered. Mother, Vanessa said, with a tone that was all performance. "How are you? I was in the area and thought I'd drop by." Margaret stood slowly. "I'm fine." Vanessa glanced around the room, her eyes noting the changes: the new bedding, the warm-toned curtains, the small potted orchid on the windowsill. "They've upgraded," she said, almost to herself. "They have," Margaret replied. Vanessa paused. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about the house. I know we said we'd discuss it, but I already know," Margaret interrupted calmly. "You sold it 6 months ago." Vanessa blinked. "How do you?" "I looked it up. The records are public. You didn't tell me because you assumed I'd never check." "I needed the money," Vanessa said, her voice now defensive. "And you weren't going back there anyway." "You never intended to let me return," Margaret said, her voice low. "You made that decision the moment you called me a burden." Vanessa froze. "You heard that?" "I did." There was a long silence. I was under pressure, Vanessa began, her voice cracking. Work was hard. The boys needed more time. And I was inconvenient. Margaret finished. Let's not pretend. Vanessa looked down, ashamed. I'm not angry anymore, Margaret said. But I am different, and I need you to know something. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was the new brochure mock-up for Linden Haven, complete with logo, mission statement, and founder bio. Vanessa opened it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page, then looked up. You own this place. I do, Margaret replied. As of last week. Vanessa stared in stunned silence. You bought a nursing home. I bought back my dignity, Margaret said, her voice strong, and I rebuilt something in the process. Vanessa sank into the nearby chair. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Margaret said. Just know that I am not your problem. I never was. That night, Vanessa left without asking for anything more. Margaret stood at her window long after the sun went down, the folder still in her hand. It wasn't revenge, she felt. It wasn't pride. It was peace. She was, for the first time in a long time, her own person again. And as the hallway lights dimmed and residents retired to their rooms, Margaret sat at the piano and played a quiet lullaby. Not for them, for herself. The kind of melody that says, you've come through the storm, and you're finally home. Margaret awoke to a gentle knock at her door. The morning sun poured through the newly installed sheer curtains, casting soft golden lines on the polished floor. It had been 2 weeks since she officially took over Rosefield, now renamed Linden Haven, and yet each morning still felt surreal. Gone were the bland oatmeal breakfasts and faded beige walls. The facility was undergoing a transformation, not just in bricks and paint, but in soul. Each staff member now wore badges bearing the new emblem, a blooming linden tree wrapped in a circle, symbolizing unity, healing, and growth. The knock came again, firmer this time. Come in, Margaret said, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. Miriam peeked in, her face glowing with cautious excitement. Miss Elwood, sorry, Mrs. Elwood. We just finished the final setup in the East Wing. Would you like to see it before the residents arrive? Margaret smiled and nodded. Yes, I'd like that. As she followed Miriam through the hallways, she noted the subtle but meaningful changes. The walls were now adorned with art pieces made by the residents during art therapy sessions. Small memory boards had been installed beside each room's door, displaying photos, names, and favorite quotes. It made the home feel more personal, more alive. They reached the East Wing, which had once been the dullest part of the building, poorly lit, understaffed, and often avoided. Now, as Margaret stepped inside, she gasped softly. The lighting had been redone, with soft, warm fixtures. The floors had been refinished with vinyl that looked like natural wood, and a series of tall, healthy plants lined the corridor. This, she said quietly, feels like home. Miriam beamed. We've also moved the memory care residence here. More sunlight, easier access to the new garden, and it's quieter than the West Wing. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good thinking. These details matter. They continued walking until they reached the new Linden Haven garden, where there was once a patchy lawn and broken benches. Now stood a thoughtfully landscaped space with paved walking paths, raised flower beds, and shaded seating. In one corner, a resident named Ruth, who used to be a botany professor, had already begun tending a row of marigolds. Margaret approached her. How does it feel to get your hands back in the soil? Ruth chuckled, brushing dirt from her palms. Like I've been given back a part of myself. That sentiment echoed across Linden Haven as changes continued to unfold. A new menu launched in the dining hall, featuring home-cooked meals prepared with fresh ingredients. Harold, the former postman, had taken charge of the coffee nook and now ran a morning coffee hour. Elise coordinated a poetry reading circle every Thursday, and even DeRosalie, more skeptical than sentimental, was heading up a newsletter written by and for residents. But with all this growth came new challenges. The increased activity brought logistical hurdles, staffing needs, scheduling conflicts, supply shortages. Margaret had never managed a business before, and the weight of every decision settled heavily on her shoulders. Some evenings, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was in over her head. Asterisk Gregory noticed this during one of their weekly review meetings. "You need a deputy," he said, placing a report down in front of her. "Someone who can handle the daily minutia so you can focus on vision." "I'm not ready to let go," she admitted. "You wouldn't be letting go," he said. "You'd be building further." Delegating isn't surrender, it's strategy. Margaret knew he was right. A week later, Henry, the eldercare consultant, introduced her to a woman named Nadine Carter, retired operations manager, who had once run one of the most respected assisted living facilities on the East Coast. Nadine was in her late 60s, sharp, efficient, and had a reputation for being fiercely compassionate. Asterisk Margaret interviewed her personally in the new Linden Lounge. Asterisk Why now? She asked. Asterisk I lost my husband last year, Nadine replied, hands folded on her lap. I needed time to grieve. Now I want to build something meaningful again. Your story inspired me. I want to be part of this. Asterisk Margaret studied her for a long moment. This isn't a job, it's a movement. Asterisk I know, Nadine said with a soft smile, and I'm ready. Asterisk hiring Nadine proved to be one of Margaret's most empowering decisions. With her overseeing operations, Margaret found more time to connect directly with the residents and staff. She began hosting weekly town halls where any one resident, nurse, or janitor could raise concerns or share ideas. Asterisk it was during one of these meetings that a young orderly named Marcus stood up and suggested a mentorship program between staff and residents. Asterisk some of the residents here had amazing careers, teachers, musicians, business owners. He said, I think younger staff could learn a lot from them. The idea resonated instantly. Margaret ran with it, launching Legacy Circles, a mentorship initiative that paired residents with staff or local high school volunteers. Elise mentored a shy young girl who wanted to be a librarian. Harold shared stories of wartime correspondence with a college student majoring in history. Even Dora reluctantly agreed to coach a culinary student in writing humorous essays about food. Asterisk, it was a hit. Asterisk the media caught wind of the transformation. A local journalist requested an interview, and Margaret agreed carefully. She sat in the garden, flanked by Gregory and Nadine, and told her story plainly. Asterisk I was called a burden, she said, not with bitterness, but with clarity. But I wasn't a burden. I was unheard. And that's what Linden Haven is about. Voices, reclaiming dignity. Asterisk the article went viral. Donations began to pour in. Former students of Margaret's from across the country sent letters of support. A regional health board offered a grant for expanding the arts and memory care programs. The momentum was real, and it was growing. With success, however, came scrutiny. During one staff meeting, Nadine pulled Margaret aside. Carla Denning's been asking questions, she said. She still has friends on the board of elder care administrators. She's trying to find anything to discredit the transfer. Asterisk Margaret sighed. Let her try. We've done everything by the book. Asterisk still, it unsettled her. Not because she feared being exposed, but because the idea of someone trying to sabotage something so pure made her heart ache. She had expected opposition from within, but it hurt to know Carla, who once ignored resident complaints and rolled her eyes at elder autonomy, wanted to poison what she could no longer control. The board eventually summoned Margaret for a review. She attended and prepared, carrying records, testimonials, and photographs. The room was full of suitsmen and women who measured success in occupancy rates and revenue margins. Margaret stood before them in her simple blouse and spoke with grace. Asterisk, I didn't come here to be admired, she said. I came here to restore what was lost. Ask the residents, ask the staff. We've built a home, not just a facility. And no one here will ever be called a burden again. Asterisk the board, moved and impressed, gave her a standing vote of support. Asterisk when she returned to Linden Haven that evening, the sun was setting in a wash of amber light. The residents had thrown a surprise party in the lounge, balloons, cupcakes, and a hand-painted sign that read, Thank you, Margaret. Asterisk Harold gave a short toast to the woman who brought the music back. Asterisk Dora raised a teacup. To the woman who proved being old doesn't mean being over. Asterisk Margaret laughed through her tears. She stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by love, resilience, and the renewed spirit of dozens of people who had once felt invisible. Asterisk later that night, she sat at her piano. Her fingers moved gently over the keys. each note a thread in the tapestry she'd spent weeks weaving, notes of redemption, of quiet power, of faith and forgotten things. Asterisk. And as the melody drifted into the hallway, the sound settled softly into every corner of Linden Haven, as though the building itself was finally breathing again. Asterisk. Margaret woke to the soft sound of birdsong just beyond the open window. The air smelled of fresh earth, the garden having been watered at dawn by Marcus and 2 other young staff members. For the first time in years, she felt surrounded not by institutional routine but by community. Linden Haven was no longer a place of waiting, it had become a place of living, breathing, and belonging. Asterisk. She sat up slowly, her knees aching from age but her spirit firm. Another resident, Maureen, had taken to calling her the General in Pearls, and Margaret secretly liked it. It was fitting. She had led with kindness, with vision, and with an iron backbone she hadn't realized still lived within her. She had glanced at the calendar beside her bed. Today was important. The monthly resident staff showcase was scheduled for the afternoon, a program her team had initiated to foster intergenerational exchange, laughter, and appreciation. Asterisk. But even as she readied herself for the day, her mind remained occupied. The winds of change had brought peace, but they had also stirred up memories of a woman who once sat quietly in a wheelchair, dismissed by her own daughter, left with nothing but silence and fluorescent ceilings. Asterisk. Vanessa had not reached out since her last visit. There had been no calls, no emails, not even a note. Margaret often thought about the young girl she'd raised. The vibrant teenager who played with her bracelets while watching television on the floor. The ambitious woman who had built a corporate life so vast it left no room for her aging mother. The silence between them now felt like a scar-healed wound that still ached when touched. Asterisk. But Margaret had not let that silence define her. If anything, it had pushed her further into her mission. She poured herself into Linden Haven's transformation, dedicating each day to proving that life did not end with wrinkles and wheelchairs. The facility was now more than a home, it was a story of revival. And every resident, every staff member, was a page in that story. Asterisk. At 10 a.m., Margaret met with Nadine in the conference room to review the upcoming state inspection. While Margaret had no doubts about the improvements made, she wanted to ensure every aspect of the facility met or exceeded standards. Nadine had compiled a binder the size of a dictionary full of updated compliance charts, menus, safety checks, and certifications. Asterisk. We're in excellent shape, Nadine said, adjusting her glasses, and with the Legacy Circle and the art therapy program in place, we've exceeded engagement expectations. You'll impress them. Asterisk. Margaret nodded but didn't smile. There's something else I want to do, she said after a pause. Something symbolic? Asterisk. Nadine looked curious. I'm listening. Asterisk. I want to host a dinner, not just for residents but for their families. Everyone. Children. Grandchildren. I want them to see what we've built. Asterisk. A kind of reunion. Asterisk. A reintroduction, Margaret said. I want the world to see that we're not tucked away and forgotten. We're still here, and we still matter. Asterisk. Nadine grinned. I'll make it happen. Asterisk. By noon, the facility buzzed with activity. Gregory arrived to lend his support and brought with him two volunteers, former students of Margaret's who had reached out after reading the newspaper article about her journey. One of them, a music teacher named Angela, offered to organize the resident choir for the evening's showcase. Another, a digital storyteller named Ray, set up recording booths for residents to capture their life stories in audio format. Asterisk. It was a day of vibrant creativity. Elise recited a poem she'd written about rediscovery. Harold read letters he'd received during the war. Dora, to everyone's surprise, gave a humorous speech titled The Real Secret to Living Long Ignore. Everyone under 30. Asterisk. The showcase unfolded in the main hall. Margaret remained off stage, observing quietly. The laughter, the applause, the tears, it was all overwhelming in the most beautiful way. She watched as the staff danced with the residents, as grandchildren clapped with pride, as caregivers beamed with newfound joy. Asterisk. And then she noticed someone at the far end of the room. Vanessa. She stood near the entrance, wearing a deep green coat, her hair tied back, her posture tense. Margaret froze. Her daughter looked out of place among the celebration, like a note played off-key. But her eyes were locked on Margaret. Asterisk. Margaret turned toward Nadine and whispered, I need a few minutes. Asterisk, she made her way slowly across the hall, her cane tapping lightly against the polished floor. The noise around them seemed to fade as mother and daughter stood face to face, surrounded by people but wrapped in their own quiet bubble. Asterisk, I read the article, Vanessa said before Margaret could speak. I saw the photos. You've done all this. Asterisk, I have, Margaret said, with a lot of help. But yes, asterisk, Vanessa looked down. I thought it was just a phase, that you were angry, trying to make a point. Asterisk, I was angry, Margaret admitted, and I was making a point, but not just to you, to myself, to everyone who ever thought old age meant irrelevance. Asterisk, there was a long silence. The music resumed behind them. The choir had begun to sing, led by Angela on piano. Asterisk, Vanessa exhaled. I've been thinking a lot about what I said, about what I did, about how I left you here. Asterisk, Margaret's voice was gentle but steady. You didn't just leave me here, you left me behind. Asterisk, I know, Vanessa said, her eyes moistening, and I was wrong. Asterisk, Margaret's heart ached with a mix of pain and hope. Why are you here now? Asterisk, I needed to see it with my own eyes, to understand how you rose from all of it. Asterisk, I didn't rise alone, Margaret said, gesturing toward the crowd. We rose together. Asterisk, they stood side by side, watching the residents sing in chorus. We're not fading, we're not gone, we're still dancing, still strong. Asterisk, Vanessa turned to her. Can I stay for dinner? Asterisk, Margaret gave a faint smile. That depends. Are you staying as my daughter, or as a guest of Linden Haven? Asterisk, Vanessa looked startled for a second, then nodded slowly. As your daughter, if you'll have me. Asterisk, Margaret linked her arm through hers. Then let's go get a seat. Asterisk, dinner was served family style in the newly renovated dining hall, under chandeliers rescued from storage and polished until they gleamed. Long tables had been set with white linens and centerpieces of lavender and rosemary. Residents sat beside their loved ones. Staff moved among them like old friends. Laughter flowed like music, and toasts were raised again and again. Asterisk, during dessert, Nadine clinked her glass and stood. Asterisk, we have one more surprise, she said, a message from the woman who made all of this possible. Asterisk, the room fell quiet. Margaret rose slowly, her hands steady, her heart full. Asterisk, I don't believe in fairy tales, she began. I believe in second chances. I believe that time, while it may bend our backs and blur our memories, never erases our worth. Asterisk, she paused. A few people dabbed at their eyes. Asterisk, we are not a burden, she continued. We are a legacy. And this Linden Haven is proof that healing is possible at any age, for the body, for the spirit, and yes, even for families. Asterisk, she raised her glass. To us, to today, and to all the days we still have left. The room erupted in applause. Later that night, Vanessa lingered outside Margaret's room. You were always a force, she said quietly. I just didn't see it until now. Asterisk, Margaret turned to her, her voice softer than before. Maybe now we both see each other more clearly. Asterisk, they embraced tentatively at first, then fully, fiercely. Asterisk, and as Vanessa left with a promise to return, Margaret sat by the window once more, watching the stars begin to emerge. Asterisk, she thought, about the girl she once was, the woman she became, and the fire that had never gone out and dimmed, waiting to be stoked again. Asterisk, and now, she no longer just felt alive, she felt whole. The following morning, sunlight flooded Margaret's room with a soft glow. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains as she sat by her desk, sipping fresh mint tea and scribbling into the notebook that had once been her lifeline during her quiet resistance. So much had changed. Yet, as she reflected on the previous night and Vanessa's unexpected return, the family dinner, the warmth of the community she had helped nurture, Margaret knew the transformation was still unfolding, not just for Linden Haven, but for herself. Asterisk, she rose slowly and moved to the mirror. The face that stared back was older, certainly, lined and weathered, but those eyes, fierce, thoughtful, resolute, remained untouched by time. She wore her age now not like a burden, but like armor. It protected her, reminded her of the roads she had walked, the years she had endured, and the new paths she had created from the ruins of disappointment. Asterisk, her day began, as usual, with the morning community circle. Residents and staff gathered in the lounge with coffee and pastries while Margaret facilitated the conversation. Today's topic, moments we thought we were forgotten. Asterisk there was a pause. Then Harold, holding his battered journal, cleared his throat. Asterisk when I came here, he said, I thought I'd just fade away. No more stories to tell. No one to listen. But now, every letter I wrote during the war is part of our archive. People ask questions, they care, and I don't feel like dust anymore. Asterisk the group nodded. Dora, never one to be sentimental, added, I used to be invisible to the nurses. Now, they ask about my blood pressure and my baking. In that order, asterisk laughter rippled through the room. Margaret watched with pride. These moments were the reason she had fought to buy the place. A nursing home was supposed to be a shelter, not a shadow. She had turned it into a sanctuary. Asterisk after the meeting, Nadine joined her in the courtyard for their usual administrative rundown. There were updates on hiring, a potential new grant for memory care expansion, and an upcoming visit from the Department of Aging's Innovation Committee. Margaret listened carefully, offering notes and questions, but her thoughts kept drifting toward a letter she'd received that morning. Asterisk it was from a woman named Camilla Dunn, a writer for a national magazine that featured stories of extraordinary reinvention. Camilla had read the local piece on Margaret and wanted to conduct an in-depth interview for the magazine's spring edition. She wrote, Your journey is not only inspiring, it redefines what aging leadership can mean. I'd like to capture it fully for others who may have been told they're too late to matter. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Do you think I should do it? She asked Nadine, handing her the note. Asterisk Nadine scanned it quickly. Absolutely. Your story isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever been dismissed too early. Asterisk Margaret smiled. Then let's schedule it. Asterisk as Nadine returned to her office, Margaret made her way to the newly renovated studio space, once an unused storage room, now transformed into the story booth, a small, soundproof room where residents recorded memories and lessons from their lives. Angela, the young music teacher, managed the schedule and helped with recordings. Today, Margaret was recording her own session. Asterisk she stepped inside the studio, closed the door, and sat before the microphone. The soft foam padding and dim light gave the space a warm intimacy. Angela tapped a few buttons on the console and nodded. Asterisk we're rolling, she whispered. Margaret leaned toward the microphone and began. My name is Margaret Elwood. I was born in 1965. I've been a teacher, a wife, a mother, a pianist, and for a while, I was someone the world stopped seeing. But I didn't stop seeing myself, and that made all the difference. Asterisk she continued for nearly an hour, recounting her early years, her passion for music, the love she shared with her late husband Charles, and her years as a devoted mother. When she reached the part about being left at Rosefield, her voice faltered slightly, but she pressed on. Asterisk I heard my daughter call me a burden, she said softly. It broke something inside me, but the pieces didn't stay broken. I used them to build something else. Asterisk when she finished, Angela walked in and hugged her. That was beautiful. Asterisk later that day, the atmosphere at Linden Haven buzzed with an unusual kind of energy. The residents were preparing for the second community festival idea Margaret had suggested as a seasonal celebration of life. There were booths being set up in the garden, hand-painted crafts, baked goods, a small stage for music. Gregory brought his nephew's jazz band to perform. Children from the local school had come to volunteer and entertain the residents with songs and magic tricks. Asterisk the residents once slouched, sleepy, and disengaged, now beamed with pride. Some helped run stalls. Others gave guided tours to visiting families. The Legacy Circles shared presentations, showcasing projects created through intergenerational partnerships. Asterisk Margaret walked slowly through the event, accepting greetings, compliments, and hugs. She stopped often, chatting, listening, smiling. She was no longer just a resident or even an owner. She had become a symbol, a living testament to what could happen when hope met purpose. Asterisk Vanessa arrived midway through the afternoon, dressed more casually this time. She looked around with open admiration. A staff member handed her a program booklet that read, Linden Haven, Festival of Resilience. Margaret found her near the poetry reading booth. You came, she said. Asterisk I wouldn't have missed it, Vanessa replied, her voice soft. Asterisk they walked together through the garden, past flower beds now blooming with marigolds, lavender, and daisies. Vanessa paused to admire the memorial bench Margaret had commissioned in honor of Charles, engraved with the words, You taught me to listen. I finally heard myself. Asterisk, you've done something extraordinary, Vanessa said. Something I don't think I ever could. Asterisk, you could, Margaret replied, if you ever had to. Asterisk, Vanessa turned to her mother. I was scared. You started needing things I didn't know how to give, and it made me selfish. Asterisk, you were overwhelmed, Margaret said. But that doesn't excuse forgetting who someone is. Asterisk, I want to be part of this, Vanessa said, her eyes beginning to water, not just as your daughter, but as someone who learns from you. Asterisk, Margaret's eyes softened. She reached out and took Vanessa's hand. Asterisk, then, start by listening. Just like I had to. Asterisk, they continued walking, arm in arm, past the booths, the music, the laughter. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, you know, for years I was afraid of being irrelevant, of fading into a corner, but now I realize that relevance isn't about youth or speed, it's about voice, and I found mine again. Asterisk, Vanessa nodded, and it's beautiful. Asterisk, as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the garden, the jazz band played a slow, sweet tune. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the residents dance, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers, but all moving to the rhythm in their own way. Staff joined in. Children giggled. Life was everywhere. Asterisk, Nadine approached with a grin. We've been offered a spot in the State Aging Conference next month. They want you to speak. Asterisk, Margaret raised an eyebrow. Public speaking again? After all these years, they're calling you the Linden Lady, Nadine added playfully. Margaret laughed. Fine, but only if we bring a resident choir. Asterisk, deal. Asterisk, as twilight settled in, the lanterns in the garden flickered to life, casting warm glows across tables and faces. The smell of cinnamon bread from the baking stall mingled with the scent of fresh flowers, and in that moment, surrounded by the people she had once called strangers, now family, Margaret felt a calm she hadn't known since she was a young mother watching her daughter fall asleep to the sound of her piano. Asterisk, everything had come full circle, from pain to peace, from isolation to inclusion, from silence to a festival of voices. Asterisk, and she knew deep in her soul that her story, once almost buried beneath regret, had not just been revived, it had been rewritten. The morning of Margaret's 61st birthday arrived quietly, without fanfare or fuss. She woke before dawn, her room wrapped in the silver blue light of a cloudless sky. She sat up in bed, hands resting in her lap, listening to the birds, beginning their morning chatter outside the window. This birthday felt different from all the others, not because of the number, but because of everything that had come before it. She no longer felt forgotten, no longer invisible. She was rooted, respected, whole. Asterisk, a small envelope sat on her nightstand. It had been slid under her door some time before dawn, handwritten in careful cursive. She opened it and smiled. It was from Dora. Asterisk, happy birthday, Maggie. You were the lightning that shook this old place awake. I'm proud to call you my friend. P.S. Don't skip breakfast today, we have plans. Asterisk, Margaret chuckled softly, folded the note, and placed it into the drawer beside other notes she'd collected over the year, testimonials, thank you letters, personal messages from residents, their families, and even some staff. They weren't trophies, they were reminders. Each note was evidence that her efforts had mattered. Asterisk, she rose, dressed in a flowing navy blue dress with a silver brooch shaped like a treble clef, a nod to the music that had never left her. She walked the familiar halls of Linden Haven, noticing how the sunlight seemed to rest gently against the polished floors, and the smell of fresh scones floated in the air. Asterisk, when she reached the dining hall, it was empty at first glance, silent, still. Asterisk, then suddenly confetti exploded from behind a rolling bookcase, and the room erupted in a chorus of happy birthday. Asterisk, dozens of residents, staff, and volunteers filled the room, clapping and laughing. Dora wheeled forward with a cupcake balanced on a small saucer, a single flickering candle on top. Margaret's mouth opened in surprise, and then, almost instinctively, her hand went to her heart. You didn't, she whispered, eyes wide. We did, Dora grinned, because you gave us everything. We wanted to give you a little something back. Asterisk, the room was decorated with streamers in soft pastels, paper flowers made in craft therapy sessions, and a large banner that read, Happy Birthday to the Heart of Linden Haven. Asterisk, Margaret laughed, the sound light and melodic. You sneaky devils, she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. You all planned this behind my back. Asterisk, it wasn't hard, Nadine said, stepping forward. You're so busy worrying about everyone else. We had time to scheme. Asterisk, Gregory arrived moments later, carrying a wrapped box. He hugged her tightly and whispered, I got the old deed. Framed. You'll want to see it. Asterisk, he handed her the package. Inside was a framed side-by-side display of the original Rosefield deed and the new Linden Haven charter, signed with her name at the bottom in elegant ink. She traced her finger along the edge of the frame, the weight of the journey flooding her mind. Asterisk, Elise took to the microphone and read a poem she had written for the occasion. It spoke of rivers that change course, of seeds that grow in silence, and of women who build homes, not just from walls, but from courage. As the applause echoed, Margaret stood to speak. I came here with a broken hip and a bruised soul, she began. I thought my life had reached its quiet end, but this place, this community showed me that endings are just the other side of beginnings. We are not here to fade, we are here to shine. The room erupted in applause. That afternoon, as the celebration settled into casual conversations and gentle music, Margaret found herself walking through the gardens, now lush and vibrant. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary and thyme. Children laughed as they played near the new butterfly trellis. Volunteers were helping residents plant winter bulbs. Margaret paused beside a stone bench, the very one she had once sat on while planning her rebellion months earlier. Vanessa joined her minutes later. I brought something, she said, pulling a small package from her bag. Asterisk, Margaret opened it carefully. Inside was a photo album, not of her childhood, not even of Vanessa's youth, but of Linden Haven before and after. The first page held a photo of Margaret in her wheelchair on her first day, taken secretly by a nurse. She looked small, tired, unsure. Asterisk, the last photo was taken the night before, at the community festival. Margaret stood at the center of a crowd of residents, staff, and children, head held high, smiling, radiant. I thought it might be time to remember, Vanessa said. Margaret closed the album gently. Thank you. Asterisk, Vanessa hesitated, then said, I also wanted to ask, can I volunteer here, even just once a week? Asterisk, Margaret looked at her, long and hard. There was no pride in her eyes, no bitterness, only sincerity. Asterisk, not as my daughter, Margaret said, as someone who understands what this place stands for. Asterisk, I do, Vanessa replied, more than ever. Asterisk, that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Margaret stood alone in the music room. The Steinway piano, a donation from a grateful family, waited silently in the corner. She walked over, sat gently on the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. She began to play. It wasn't Chopin or Beethoven. It was something she had composed, herself, a soft, flowing piece that carried with it every note of sorrow, every chord of resistance, and every crescendo of triumph she had experienced. The music moved through the halls like a blessing, reaching the ears of those in their rooms, those in the courtyard, those quietly listening. Tears slid down Dora's cheek as she sat near the door. She's playing her story, she whispered, to Nadine. Asterisk, Gregory sat nearby with his hands folded, eyes closed, letting the melody settle into his memory like a prayer. Asterisk, when the last note faded, silence fell, not the kind of silence that followed an ending, but the kind that honored what had just been shared. Asterisk, Margaret stood, placed her hands on the polished wood, and bowed her head. Then she whispered into the empty room, thank you for waiting for me. Asterisk, that night, alone in her room, she wrote a final entry in the notebook that had followed her through every step of the journey. Asterisk, greater than I was called a burden, but I became a builder. I was left behind, but I stepped forward. I was forgotten, but I remembered who I was, and now, I carry no anger, only grace. My story did not end when they said it would. It began again, louder, bolder, and more beautiful than I ever imagined. Asterisk, she placed the notebook into a small wooden box, locking it with the tiny brass key Charles had once given her for their keepsake drawer. She set it on the bookshelf beside framed photos of the residents, staff, and the new Linden Haven charter. Asterisk, as she turned out the light and lay back on her bed, her body ached with the wear of the day, but her heart was light. There were still struggles ahead. There would always be bills to review, complaints to address, losses to mourn, but none of that could undo what had been created. Asterisk, she was not merely a survivor of neglect. She was the architect of dignity, and long after her music stopped, long after her name was no longer spoken in the halls, Linden Haven would remain not as a building of stone and plaster, but as a living testament to the woman who was once called a burden, asterisk, and who answered, not with bitterness, but by buying the very place they tried to leave her, in end, filling it with light, asterisk.